welcome to this Thrive London webinar on phobias. My name is Cecile Bowie, and I have a background in mental health with a doctorate in psychoanalytic studies and more than 20 years of direct contact with patients and practice in mental health. Our objectives for today are to try and understand the neurology behind fear, to distinguish between a profound dislike and what is a genuine phobia, to explore how phobias have a tendency to appear spontaneously, disappear spontaneously, and reappear spontaneously as well. We'll be looking at what can be reassuring and how to signpost a person. We'll also take a look at what hinders and what helps and how stigma is impacting people who experience a phobia. So, what is fear? The American psychologist Dr. Paul Ekman has published a number of years ago the Atlas of Emotions, within which he's exploring a range of emotions, including fear. And he has determined at least 3 major factors: intensity, how severe is the harm that is threatened; timing, is the harm immediate or perhaps impending; and coping, what, if any, actions can be taken to reduce or perhaps eliminate the threat. In the following video, Dr. Joy Hirsch, who is a neuropsychiatrist and a professor of psychiatry, is going to explain to us how through MRI imagery they have been able with their research team to establish where fear is born, what it looks like, what may trigger it as well, but also the very important question that is yet to be answered: why do some of us have certain fear responses to given situations? I do hope you enjoy this very interesting video.
As a neuroscientist, I'm interested in understanding how the brain reacts under conditions of various types of emotion. And the way we usually do that is to do functional neuroimaging. We ask people to participate in experiments where they are in an MRI scanner. In the case of fear, what we do is employ an image of a fearful face. The fearful face is the more universally successful stimulus. Like, not all people are afraid of spiders, particularly if you're in a scanner and you know that nothing bad can happen to you. But a fearful face seems to be more resistant to editing, which is really interesting because it suggests that you don't actually have to be in a fear-inducing situation to feel or experience the emotion of fear. And so in the case of an experiment that involves a stimulus that's associated with fear, what we would do is ask somebody to do a task, like identify the color of something. But we might, prior to that time, present a fearful face or a neutral face. And we would then behaviorally determine how the experience of the fearful face affected the behavior. We could see an effect on the neural circuitry, and particularly the neural circuitry that's involved is known to be sensitive to emotional stimuli, particularly the amygdala. The question of how fear manifests itself in the brain is what probably philosophers would refer to as the hard problem. We can see effects of a fearful face, and we see that these effects are different than when the face has a neutral expression. But does that mean that that is how the brain processes fear? the experience of fear is very individualized, that some people experience fear almost as a thrill. Some people experience it as something that is very dreadful and avoidable. So we can image activity in the brain in relationship to a, quote, fearful stimulus. But the question of exactly how the brain reacts to or manages or represents fear isn't really answered.
So I do hope you have enjoyed that. And what appears very clearly is, although we have an understanding of the mechanisms, perhaps, that are from a neuropsychological or neuropsychiatric perspective, triggering a fear response in our brains, we still have an evident lack of clarity around why different individuals respond differently to fear stimulus. And probably that can already start helping us understanding that while some of us may not have any degree of a pathological response to fear and may perhaps be able to apply certain coping mechanisms in the face of fear, others, and actually many of us, may find it perhaps more complicated for them to respond to certain fears accordingly. And that's particularly relevant to talking about phobias. Perhaps where we want to begin here to understand how these disorders can affect us is to understand what the prevalence of phobias may be. I'm going to provide you with 3 figures and perhaps a small moment of reflection for you to determine the number of people that are estimated to be experiencing a phobia or phobias in the UK. Do you think it would be 7 million people? Would it be 10 million of us? Or perhaps 5 million of us? Now, I hope that was enough time. The response perhaps might surprise some of you. As it happens, recent statistics gathered by the NHS and published in 2021 signal to us that an estimated 10 million of people in the UK are experiencing a phobia or phobias. This is actually making phobias the most common type of anxiety disorder, because this is what we're talking about. A phobia is an anxiety disorder. And as mental health first aiders, you are familiar, you've had discussions in your training around anxiety disorders, around the difficulty that there may be to distinguish between one anxiety disorder and another, because a lot of the time symptoms of anxiety will be very similar and will be found in a lot of anxiety disorders. However, there are some specificities to phobias that we're going to explore a little bit further. So 10 million of people may have phobias in the UK. They can affect any one of us, regardless of age, sex, or social background. There are 2 types of phobias that are clinically recognized. The first group will be what's called simple phobias. So it doesn't mean they're simple at all, but what we know about them that is that they probably appear quite early in childhood, so averagely between the ages of 4 and 8, and they can be things such as being terrified of going to the dentist or the doctor, perhaps. They could be things such as suddenly experiencing a fear of dogs. It's a very wide range. Fear of spiders is one of them, for example. It's a very wide range of phobias. This is where we find most phobias, as a matter of fact. The second group of phobias is known as complex phobias, of which there are 2. The first one is known as agoraphobia, and agoraphobia can be the fear of getting out of home, being exposed to big spaces, essentially, perhaps also being exposed to crowds, or essentially finding yourself in a place where you may not be too sure about where the exit or what the exit route might be, so how to escape that situation, essentially. And the second complex phobia is known as social phobia. Now, these may start later in life, so perhaps around puberty, sometimes a little bit later, up to the early 20s. These complex phobias, unfortunately, sometimes can continue for years, particularly if a person may find that they have difficulty talking about what they experience, accessing support, and these two phobias can be actually very isolating and extremely debilitating when they are left unattended. Now, distinguishing between perhaps what we call a profound dislike and a phobia is very often something that people ask me questions about in courses. For example, how do I know that what I experience in terms of fear, if I'm faced up to a certain situation, is fear or actually is a phobia? Now, what we know about phobias is that they will tend to trigger an immediate fear response at the very thought of the object of that phobia. So just thinking about that fear is going to probably trigger symptoms such as an increased heart rate, sweat, feeling hot and cold, and perhaps numbing or tingling in the fingers, trembling, and of course the triad response that we know as flight, fight, or freeze. And all of these will manifest and are induced by a sudden discharge of adrenaline. Adrenaline is what we produce a lot of the time when our brain is receiving information relating to an immediate threat or danger. And whilst this is a very natural reaction in all humans, or most humans, the problem with that type of reaction is that sometimes it is perhaps not quite adapted to the reality of the situation. However, in the case of phobias, it is extremely important to understand and to validate the reality of the fear experienced at the time by the person. Phobias can also be incredibly mysterious. It is difficult to understand how they can appear so incredibly suddenly, like seeming like they have come absolutely out of nowhere and around perhaps an object that the person cannot relate to having or experiencing sense of trauma around. They can also equally spontaneously disappear, particularly in the case of simple phobias, and they have a tendency sometimes to do so, however, and without intervention, as a matter of fact, or medical or professional support. However, it is extremely important to not rely on the possibility that a phobia may very well disappear on their own, particularly in the case of debilitating phobias that are going to impact a person's daily function or limiting life outcomes and opportunities for that person. What we know is that traumatic events, ancestral neurological features, or learned repulsions that are passed on from perhaps a member of the family to another through generations a lot of the time, can all contribute to the formation of a phobia. So in this video, we're going to explore this a little bit further, and I hope you enjoy it because it gives us some incredible insight on the origin of phobias, where they may come from, and how they actually impact people on a regular basis when they experience them.
Inside you when you're having a phobic reaction. In your brain, recognizes this as a dangerous situation. Triggers your fight or flight response and takes note of your fear. It will remind you next time. Your breathing gets quicker, your wasting your energy. For most people, the prefrontal cortex, the rational, uniquely human part of your brain, can calm the amygdala down. But if you have a phobia, that process doesn't quite work. Your brain's constantly stuck in tiger attack mode. So where do phobias come from? The first phobia in history belonged to a man who was absolutely terrified of flute music, but only at night. This was described 2,500 years ago by the Greek father of medicine, but Hippocrates didn't use the word phobia. This came 500 years later, when the Roman author Celsus used it to describe a disease, hydrophobia, the fear of water, which we now know as rabies. Celsus took the word phobia from the Greek god Phobias, who was so terrifying that warriors would paint his face in their shields to fear their enemy. One of Freud's most famous case studies was a boy called Little Hans, who developed a terror of horses after seeing one collapse in the street. Freud thought that this was really an unconscious fear of his father and related to sexual feelings for his mother. Modern psychoanalysts still believe that phobias can be caused by secret internal conflicts like this. Another theory is that at least some fears are innate. One study showed young infants images of spiders and snakes and found that their pupils dilated, a sign of fear or intense focus. The theory is that fear of spiders and snakes gave us an evolutionary edge. Around 5% of people have these phobias. And perhaps the same mechanism left us with other common phobias, the fear of height, darkness, confined spaces, all dangerous while we were evolving. A huge number of phobias have been spotted and named since Little Hans. There's aiactophobia, the fear of doctors, pagonophobia, the fear of beers, and diphnophobia, fear of dinner conversation. We may not know the root cause of phobias, but we do know how they develop. You can catch a phobia by seeing other people's fear. You can be taught a phobia. Learning about germs can lead to bacillophobia. Or you can get a phobia by having a traumatic experience, especially in childhood. Despite all that, common phobias are quite similar across cultures. But one of the few that's culturally specific is taijin kufusho, the Japanese phobia of embarrassing other people. All the phobias I've mentioned are classed as simple phobias, fear of specific things, but there are two complex phobias. Social phobia is triggered by being around people you don't know, and agoraphobia by being away from home, especially without escape routes. Whilst these are serious conditions, they can be treated with therapy and medication. Simple phobias, despite the suffering they cause, are easier to treat. The NHS recommends cognitive behavioural therapy, with a therapist helping you to gradually get used to whatever it is you fear. So, if a phobia is getting you down, why not pop in and see your doctor? Unless, of course, you're reactophobic. In which case, it's probably better to have a word with a nurse.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that, be sure to check out these videos next. And if you haven't already...
Right, so there are probably a couple of things to unpack from that video that may have left you with a few questions. The first one might be that mention of hydrophobia being called or known as rabies this day, and that might have questioned you a little bit. So the reason why it may be called like that is, and this is what we're talking about, is rabies the virus, right? So why there's an association between hydrophobia and the fact that it may have been called rabies later on is because some of the later symptoms that are observed when an individual or maybe an animal is experiencing rabies is an intense dislike, fear, repulsion at hydrating, but also being touched by water, being in any sort of contact with water. Of course, translating to phobia, we have got a very different situation, as you will understand. The second point, perhaps, was the mention of psychoanalysis here, psychoanalysis, and the very famous case that Dr. Freud had been in contact with of the little hands, and how perhaps Freud had identified something on the side of libido and conflict. And yes, it is true that sort of desire that Hans had experienced towards his mother through perhaps paternal absence. The father was away and working a lot of the time, leaving little Hans and his mother spending a lot of time together in a fairly normal way, of course, as you can imagine. But the point is that it left Hans in a world of imagination that gradually became a little bit confusing for him. And it was so confusing at the time, and perhaps so anxiety prompting, that one day when in the street he heard a horse collapse. It was a time where horse carriages were occupying the streets. That literally and directly translated into him as a phobia. And perhaps it was easier for the little Hans to be terrified of horses and horse carriages and then to not go out anymore, which is exactly what happened. Little Hans stopped going out of his house. He absolutely refused getting out of the house for a fear that there would be carriages, there would be horses, and he would have to be confronted to something absolutely terrifying and that he did not understand. We can understand that for little Hans and for many of us who experience phobias that are linked to trauma, because this is the type of phobia we're looking at here, perhaps what's hiding behind the mechanism of a phobia in such a context is that it's a defense mechanism. It's perhaps a little bit easier, in massive brackets, of course, to encapsulate a degree of anxiety that is complicated to understand, to put into words, to even have access to, because this is very unconscious mechanisms we're looking at. So perhaps easier to encapsulate that anxiety that cannot be looked into, almost, into an actual object or an actual situation. This is very often the reason why many people may experience a simple phobia, but have absolutely no understanding of what could be the link between their fear and that object. Cannot quite explain to themselves why they are terrified of such a thing. This is the reason why perhaps there is a range of treatments that are available to us, and it is important that we have a good quality of choice and many options to perhaps facilitate a recovery when it comes to these phobias. Yes, some of us will prefer a very light touch approach through CBT. Exposure therapy couldn't exactly qualify as a light touch approach for any one of us experiencing a phobia, because of course the object of the therapy, or the goal of the therapy, is to gradually introduce discussions around this object, and an exposure to images of this object, and perhaps when possible getting out there into the world and being directly confronted to that fear, up to the point where we can change our thought processes enough that we are not going to be overwhelmed by what is absolutely terrifying and is justifying that phobia, essentially. Others may prefer hypnotherapy, which is a type of therapy where through hypnosis, the therapist is going to interact directly with the unconscious. And you can imagine how it's almost an avoidance strategy, but not so much, in that we are still going to therapy, we are still going to get treatment, and can be particularly efficient for some people. Others may prefer talking or psychodynamic therapy, or even psychoanalysis, or more robust psychotherapeutic approaches that will not deal with the symptoms or the thought processes, but will go a little bit deeper into the unconscious and trying to understand what are the mechanisms, what are the trauma, what is leading that anxiety that is existing. So when it comes to phobias, The difficulty sometimes that some of us may have is in feeling validated in the fear that we experience. A little bit later on, we're going to talk about the stigma and stigma barriers associated with experiencing a phobia. As with many disorders, avoidance strategies are very likely to be applied by a person experiencing a phobia. And quite frankly, it is quite logical that if something absolutely triggers immediate fear reactions, none of us is going to want to be confronted to that situation or that object of a phobia. It's important to validate the person's fear, whilst absolutely encouraging that person to consider accessing support and reassuring that person that not only is support available, but on top of that, it's extremely likely that with early intervention and a little bit of professional support, sometimes a phobia can absolutely be treated and recovered from. Phobias, unfortunately, may lead to experiencing isolation, and that, of course, can also lead to experiencing episodes of depression. So it is very possible that a person who has a phobia may also experience depression, particularly with phobias that are going to impact daily function or impact it in such a way that a number of opportunities are going to be missed, essentially, because of it. For example, phobias such as iatrophobia, which is the extreme fear of doctors and medical tests as well, can hinder a person's timely access to critical care. During the recent pandemic, this has been an issue for some people, particularly people who had a fear of needles, and still up to date, although may have been wanting to receive the vaccine, have not yet perhaps been able to go and get the vaccine done because that fear of needles is absolutely getting in the way of them. Arachnophobia, which is the extreme fear of spiders, is associated with, amongst others, the risk of car crashes. It is actually recommended to sometimes for people who have arachnophobia to check spots of the car where sometimes a spider could be hiding, to ensure that we prevent an incident, particularly on the road. So the impact can go really from sometimes mild to potentially critical and even life-threatening, as a matter of fact. This is why it's important to understand that the element around the encouragement to accessing support, it's going to be a big part of what we do as a mental health first aider. And although we're never going to pressure a person into accessing care, we absolutely never give advice. We still very much want to explore with that person what they believe could be helping them. And that, of course, begins with a non-judgmental approach, validating that the fear they experience is absolutely real, and reminding them that there is help available. And with time and patience and a bit of investment in getting help, and perhaps practical support in accessing the help, there is a quite high likelihood that a person could start feeling better. So going back to treatment options, as with all experiences of emotional distress and mental health disorders, a range of treatments may be available, and what is found to be supportive for one individual may be found to be inefficient for another. And I think it's extremely important to recognize that, because it may be that you start exploring treatment available with a person, and a person that has a phobia tells you that they have tried this or tried that, and that has not worked. So the more options we're going to bring to the table into the conversation, the greater sense of ownership and control a person experiencing emotional distress relating to a phobia may be able to regain. And then, of course, when we have a sense of control, we are a little bit more prepared to make choices and to take action on our choices. Self-help can help. So it can be a range of lifestyle elements or even changes. We know that regular exercise is very, very good in addressing all situations of anxiety. Eating regular healthy meals. So sometimes we say we are what we eat. So there's a degree of truth in that. It's probably a good idea, for example, to ensure that we're reducing or altogether avoiding all stimulants, perhaps caffeine as well, which is vastly underestimated in how it's impacting degrees of anxiety and the intensity of anxiety disorders. Getting enough sleep as well is absolutely important. So it's recommended ideally that we sleep more than 7 hours per night. Okay, we can survive on 6 hours of sleep per night, but then again, we know that prolonged through time and years, sleeping only 6 hours per night is probably not enough to maintain optimal physical health and mental health function. We also may want to explore relaxation techniques. So there's physical exercise that can help us relax. There's techniques around controlling the breathing that can help as well. Some people may find visualization techniques quite good, combined, of course, with relaxation or breathing techniques. So mentally visualizing how you may successfully deal with a situation that could cause anxiety might be a very good first step towards perhaps envisaging the possibility that you could overcome such a situation. Self-help groups as well. It's quite useful to meet others with similar experiences and to share ways of coping. It's also breaking a cycle of isolation. A very good group that is, and as a support network that is known to particularly provide support, direct support to people experiencing agoraphobia or social phobia, would be No Panic, which is a mental health charity. And the way they proceed or help people is that instead of having people coming out of their home, which they probably cannot do at the time, they will send out a volunteer to a person to their home, and there's going to be an element of friendship that's going to start happening, and gradually through meetings, perhaps that friendship is going to develop to the point where the person who is feeling like they're stuck inside of their home may be able to venture out with that volunteer, perhaps not too far, maybe a few steps off the house and a little further and further each time, essentially. So that's something that you may want to consider if you use the Hub of Hope for an application. We'll talk about that a bit later. That is a very good way to establish if where a person lives locally, there is access to No Panic groups and support. When it comes to therapy, as explained in the video and a little bit earlier, CBT or exposure therapy is something that we can access through self-referral under the NHS. And this is quite simple to find out information about that. For example, you can just walk into your GP surgery and there will be leaflets about that service, or you can go on your GP surgery website where there will be a section about mental health, emotional well-being, and a phone number and an email address that you can use to directly get in touch with the service, self-refer for counseling. Now, sometimes there will be a little bit of a wait. It really is dependent on where you live and the capacity of the service at a local scale. You will probably have an assessment appointment for triage to begin with, and that appointment, that initial appointment, can be as long as 1.5 hours, and then there may be a wait until you are able to access CBT. A good alternative, if you are in a workplace where you have access to an EAP, Employee Assistance Program, would be perhaps to get in touch with that service, and most of the time it's accessible 24/7 anonymously. It's very, very safe to use, and you probably, if you go for your mental health, you might be assessed by a mental health professional, and then you will be allocated, if it's appropriate, which is most of the time the case, you'll be allocated with a counsellor and a limited number of sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy. Hypnotherapy, we talked about that. Be aware when you're using hypnotherapy that you want to check the credentials of your hypnotherapist. So make sure that they belong to either an international or national body. that is licensed essentially to provide hypnotherapy through the UK. So just check who you are going to be seeing. That's quite important with hypnotherapy, particularly. Talking therapy or psychodynamic therapy, even psychoanalytic therapy, can be very useful to understand the underlying causes behind a phobia that a person may experience. When it comes to medication, once again, it really wants to be the last part of course. So we may want to be trying other techniques and approaches prior to thinking about medication. Antidepressants may be prescribed, beta blockers as well, which are cardiac regulators that come with little side effects to the cognitive functioning, particularly, may be prescribed as well. Benzodiazepine may be prescribed, but that would be a lot more surprising. And the reason why is that benzodiazepine is a group of medication that can lead to experiencing addiction, to withdraw symptoms upon stopping treatment. That can be particularly problematic. So it is a lot less likely that a GP or even a specialist may want to prescribe benzodiazepine, particularly in the case of phobias, where benzodiazepine can perhaps become part of an avoidance strategy, essentially. So that's quite unlikely. So as you can see, there are many options in terms of treatment, many things that you'll be able to explore with a person that you provide initial support to in that conversation. And that could help that person forming a better understanding of what could help, how it could help, and help them regain a sense of hope that they may not always feel the way that they do. They may not always experience a phobia. We ought to talk about stigma here because, as you well know, stigma is and continues being one of the single greatest barriers to many people accessing support or even just talking about how they feel a lot of the time. It's quite common for a person experiencing a phobia that they may self-stigmatize. It is also quite likely that a person experiencing a phobia has a very clear sense of awareness of the fact that the fear that they feel is not rational. There is really no need to say to a person experiencing a phobia, oh, this is irrational. Number one, that's very problematic language and that's unsupportive. Number two, that person is very well aware of that fact. Some phobias as well, when they are witnessed by others or explained by a person experiencing them, can lead others to react inappropriately with laughter, mockery, dismissal, or even to attempting practical jokes. And I've heard many stories where a person may just set up a practical joke and hide in a corner just so that they can see the fear reaction, the intense fear reaction another person may have. This is not a good idea. This is never safe to do, quite simply because if you put a person in that position where they are going to experience an intense sense of fear, they are going to produce a lot of adrenaline, and that can create a very unsafe situation. More importantly, this is not dignified, this is not respectful, and this could lead to further trauma, essentially, right? And a less possibility of a likelihood that a person is ever going to want to open up about how they feel. So please bear in mind that phobias can lead a person experiencing them to avoid situations where they may have to explain their extreme fear, quite simply because they don't want to be exposed to comments, to unwanted advice as well, and of course to practical jokes, as you can imagine. There are myths that surround phobias, and unfortunately, it is still things that we hear about, and the language that can be used can be particularly brutal for a person experiencing it. So someone experiencing a phobia, sometimes have people say, oh, they must be crazy. So again, you see the use of language is particularly problematic and discriminatory here. It's just magnified fear get over it, get over yourself, get on with it. Still, again, unfortunately, language that we hear is being utilized in relation to mental health disorders or situations of emotional distress and in relation to phobias. It is sometimes said by individuals or person who may fail at understanding the amplitude and debilitating effects a phobia may have in certain situations or in daily functioning. Just have a drink and relax. That's a common response, unfortunately, that can be received by a person experiencing aviophobia. So aviophobia is the extreme fear of flying. And that's really unhelpful, and it really comes from a person who's failing at recognizing but also validating the complex nature and realism of the fear experienced by the person at the time. Also thinking of using substances when a person is experiencing any degree of anxiety is not going to ever be a good idea, as it can precipitate or accentuate the state of crisis the person is experiencing at the time. So tackling stigma can be done in a number of ways. The first one that comes to mind is that it is important to validate the person's fear is real. It's not because something is perceived by the person themselves and others through the understanding of that fear. It's not because we know that that fear is irrational that fear is not real. I hope that makes sense. So it's important to reassure the person that their fear is nothing ridicule and nothing to be ashamed of. Us doing that, us saying that to the person, is going to perhaps break the cycle of self-stigmatization that the person is experiencing, because this is likely that the person is already telling themselves that their fear is ridiculous and quite shameful, as a matter of fact. And that's quite often the case, unfortunately, with anxiety disorders, to fear that this is ridiculous, that fear, that anxiety. If a person is experiencing a phobia, is finding themselves pressured by others, what we can do is educate people around that person, advocate for that person, and therefore demonstrate good allyship. Okay, and good allyship is understanding the fact that it's not because I don't have the same experience, or because I can't quite directly relate to a person's experience of anxiety or fear, that I cannot put myself in a position where I will make myself a little bit vulnerable through the experience of empathy, and I can get on the same wavelength and provide support and understanding. In workplaces, reasonable adjustments, flexible working hours, changes in the immediate environment can be applied whilst we encourage the person to access support, perhaps through the employee assistance program, mental health first aiders, and by signposting, of course, to a general practitioner, to self-referral to counselling under the NHS. Also by using the Hub of Hope free phone app, which provides information about local statutory and charitable services, as well as community groups and support networks as well. I hope every one of you as a mental health first aider has the Hub of Hope phone app on their phone. It is very precious help if you want to signpost a person efficiently. You can also encourage a person to download the app and find out for themselves what is available directly within their postcode remit. And that's quite empowering in its own rights. Now, outcomes. I hope that you feel that together we have explored and gained a better understanding of the neurology behind fear and why different people react differently to situations of fear, which leads to some of us experiencing a phobia at certain times. The difference as well between what we can qualify to be a profound dislike and what actually is a phobia, which helps us perhaps making sure that we use the words in the correct ways. If we do not have a phobia, but we say we have a phobia, that can lead to a person experiencing phobia feeling sometimes dismissed. So of course, we've explored some of the symptoms that can signal to us that we experience a phobia, and I hope that is helpful as well. We've looked at what phobias are and how they appear and disappear and reappear, and why it's important to get support, particularly with phobias that impact daily functioning or limit opportunities in life and outcomes as well. We've explored how stigma impacts individuals and what we can do to tackle the stigma surrounding people who experience phobias. And of course, we've looked at treatment options, what can be reassuring, and how we can signpost a person to support that will help them, perhaps looking at options that can tackle this phobia or address it in a way that is going to agree with them and give them a sense of hope that this is not going to be forever. I'd like to thank you very much for watching this webinar. You may find me on LinkedIn. You can email me if you have a further question or require more information. And in the meantime, I wish you a very good day. Thank you.